They say a mother's love is unconditional, that family stands by you when the world turns away. But sometimes the deepest cuts come from the people who raised you, and sometimes the sweetest vindication arrives exactly when you've stopped needing their approval. What would you do if your own parent publicly humiliated you, never knowing the truth you'd been quietly building? The banquet hall smelled of orchids and expensive wine, the kind of venue where crystal chandeliers refracted light into 1,000 diamonds across cream-colored walls. It was my cousin Rebecca's engagement party, one of those sprawling family gatherings where success is measured in job titles and square footage, where conversations hum with barely concealed competition. My mother stood near the entrance in her tailored navy dress, pearls at her throat, greeting guests with the practiced warmth of someone who had spent decades perfecting the art of appearances. She had always cared deeply about appearances. I arrived late, deliberately so. There's a certain advantage to entering a room after the initial pleasantries have settled, when people have already claimed their territories and established their hierarchies for the evening. My business partner Chen had texted me earlier. "Boss, do you need any of us there tonight?" I declined, thinking this was family business, personal territory separate from the company I'd spent 3 years building from nothing. I wore a simple black suit, understated, the kind that doesn't announce wealth but whispers competence to those who know how to look. My mother's eyes found me immediately across the room, and something flickered there. Not warmth, but assessment, calculation, a quick inventory of what I represented in her carefully curated social landscape. She waved me over to where she stood with a cluster of her friends, women I'd known peripherally my entire life, the kind who remembered you as a child and never quite updated their mental image. Mrs. Chen, no relation to my business partner, smiled indulgently. Mrs. Kapoor adjusted her silk scarf. My mother's college roommate, Patricia, who had flown in from Boston, extended her hand with the enthusiasm of someone delighted to see how former acquaintances had aged and failed. "Oh, is this your youngest?" Patricia asked, though she knew perfectly well who I was. My mother's smile tightened, almost imperceptibly at the corners. "Yes, this is Jordan," my mother said, her voice carrying that peculiar tone I'd learned to recognize over the years, affection laced with disappointment, pride undercut by reservation. "Still finding themselves, you know how it is with this generation. Still unemployed, but we're hopeful something will come along eventually." The words landed in the space between us like stones dropped into still water, ripples spreading outward. Mrs. Kapoor's expression shifted to practiced sympathy. Patricia made a soft noise of understanding. My mother patted my arm with a touch that felt more like dismissal than comfort. The interesting thing about humiliation is how it calcifies over time. The first instance stings, sharp and immediate. But repetition builds something harder, a kind of armor formed from compressed hurt. This wasn't the first time. At Thanksgiving 2 years ago, she'd introduced me to her book club as taking a little break from the real world. At my brother's wedding, I'd been exploring options and trying different things. Never mind that I'd been working 16-hour days, that I'd taken a struggling startup and transformed it into something viable, something real. She'd asked once, early on, what I was doing. "Building a digital platform," I'd said. She'd heard, "unemployed." In her world, employment meant corner offices and business cards from recognizable companies, not the messy uncertainty of entrepreneurship. I had learned not to correct her. What was the point? She would nod, smile, and within a week, introduce me the same way to someone new, as though the truth couldn't quite penetrate the image she'd constructed. My father, gentler but eternally conflict-averse, would change the subject. My older brother, the surgeon, would sometimes offer me sympathetic looks across the dinner table but never contradicted her narrative. In my mother's carefully ordered universe, I was the disappointment, the child who hadn't followed the approved path, who had somehow failed to launch despite being 31 years old. And perhaps part of me had stopped trying to change her mind, had decided instead to simply build something so undeniable that one day the truth would emerge on its own terms, not mine. But tonight, hearing those words again, still unemployed, something shifted. Not anger, exactly. More a kind of quiet recognition that some people will only see you the way they've decided to see you, regardless of reality. I opened my mouth, though I wasn't sure what I intended to say when my phone buzzed insistently in my pocket. Then again, and again. I excused myself, stepping toward the tall windows that overlooked the garden, where fairy lights were strung between trees like captured stars. Chen's name flashed on the screen, then Priya, then Marcus. I frowned, a thread of concern pulling tight. It was Saturday evening. The team should have been anywhere but working. I answered Chen's call. "Boss, I'm so sorry to interrupt your family thing," he said, his voice tight with stress. "But we have a situation. The Singapore client moved their timeline up. They need the presentation Monday morning their time, which means we have about 30 hours. The whole team is at the office. I know it's your cousin's party, but I can be there in 40 minutes, I said, the familiar switch flipping in my mind from family mode to crisis management. Tell everyone to hold tight. Order dinner for the team. Use the company card. I'm on my way. I ended the call and turned to find my mother watching me from across the room, her expression unreadable. I walked back to her circle, which had grown to include my Aunt Susan and two of Rebecca's future in-laws. "I'm sorry. I have to leave," I said simply. My mother's eyes narrowed slightly. "Is everything all right?" she asked, though her tone suggested the question was more about propriety than genuine concern. "Work emergency," I replied. "I need to go." The words hung there for a moment, and I watched her process them, watched her decide how to frame this new information into her existing narrative. She turned to her audience with a small, apologetic smile. "Jordan does some freelance computer work," she explained to the group, her voice warm with maternal tolerance. "Always such odd hours, these gig economy jobs. Though I keep telling them, at some point you need real stability, real benefits." Patricia nodded knowingly. "Mrs." Chen made a sympathetic sound. And there it was again, my reality translated through her lens into something diminished, something less. I should have left then. I should have walked away, dealt with the crisis, let her think whatever she wanted to think. But fate, or perhaps simple coincidence, had other plans, because at that exact moment, the main doors to the banquet hall opened, and Chen walked through, followed by Priya and Marcus. They looked harried, dressed in casual weekend clothes, clearly having come straight from somewhere else. Chen spotted me immediately, relief visible on his face. They navigated through the crowd, and I saw the moment my mother registered their approach, saw her begin to calculate who these young people were and why they were interrupting her carefully orchestrated social event. "Jordan, before you leave," Chen began, then seemed to notice the audience around us. He hesitated, always more comfortable with code than crowds. Priya, more socially adept, stepped forward. "We're so sorry to interrupt your family celebration," she said, directing the apology to my mother with a respectful nod. "But we really need Jordan at the office. The Singapore contract situation." She turned to me. "Chen tried to call, but when you said 40 minutes, we realized we might be able to save time if we came to you. The car's outside. We have your laptop. We can brief you on the way." My mother's expression had shifted to polite confusion. "I'm sorry," she said, with a particular graciousness she reserved for people she was about to correct. "But I think there's been some mistake. Jordan doesn't—" She paused, searching for a diplomatic phrasing. "What company do you work for?" She directed the question to Priya, as though they were lost guests who had wandered into the wrong event. Marcus, who had been quiet until then, spoke up. His voice carried the slight edge of someone who had worked a 12-hour day already and didn't have patience for social niceties. "We work for Jordan," he said simply. "At Meridian Solutions. Jordan's our CEO." The words landed like a depth charge in deep water, quiet at first, then devastatingly expansive. My mother's face went through a remarkable journey in the span of 3 seconds. Confusion, disbelief, shock, and then a complicated mixture of emotions I couldn't quite parse. Patricia's eyebrows rose toward her hairline. "Mrs." Kapoor's mouth formed a small O of surprise. The conversations around us had begun to quiet, that peculiar ripple effect that happens when something unexpected enters a social space. "CEO?" my mother repeated, as though testing the word in an unfamiliar language. Chen, bless him, must have sensed the strange tension because he pulled out his phone and opened our company website. turning it toward my mother with the earnest helpfulness of someone trying to clear up a simple misunderstanding. Yes, Jordan founded Meridian 3 years ago. We do AI integrated supply chain optimization for mid-sized manufacturing companies. We're at 43 employees now, 8 countries. Jordan built it from nothing. I watched my mother's eyes scan the phone screen, watched her take in the professional website, the client testimonials, the press mentions. Her hand came up to her throat, fingers touching her pearls, a gesture she made when she was processing something that didn't fit her understanding of the world. 43 employees, she said softly, and I couldn't tell if she was speaking to me or to herself. The room had definitely quieted now. Rebecca's fiancé had paused mid-conversation. My father had materialized from wherever he'd been, drawn by some sixth sense that something significant was happening. Priya, who had a gift for reading rooms and knowing when to press forward, continued. We really are sorry to interrupt, Mrs. Reeves. We know how important family time is. Jordan talks about you all often. That was generous. I'd mentioned my family perhaps twice in 3 years, but this Singapore contract is the largest we've landed. 8.3 million over 2 years. Jordan's been negotiating it personally for 6 months, and if we can deliver this presentation by Monday morning Singapore time, we lock it in. If we don't, she trailed off meaningfully. 8.3 million. I watched the number register, watched my mother perform rapid mental mathematics, recalibrating every assumption she'd made. My Aunt Susan, never one for subtlety, said exactly what everyone was thinking. Wait, you own a company? With employees? And you never said anything? I met her eyes, then my mother's. I did say something, I replied quietly. Multiple times. I was told I was playing with computers and needed to get a real job. The truth of that statement settled over the gathering like snow, quiet and undeniable. My mother's face had gone pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. I saw her remember, saw specific conversations replay behind her eyes. Thanksgiving, the wedding, probably a dozen smaller moments. Every time she'd introduced me with that particular blend of apology and condescension, every time I'd tried to explain and been dismissed, my father stepped closer, his engineer's mind already working through the implications. 43 employees? He asked, his voice careful. That's substantial. That's venture capital substantial. Or did you bootstrap? Bootstrapped for the first 18 months? I said, then took a Series A from Redpoint Ventures last year. 4.2 million, we're cash flow positive now. I watched my father's eyes widen. He knew those terms, understood what they meant. My mother was still staring at Chen's phone screen, at my professionally photographed face under the heading, Founder and CEO. Her friends had gone silent, witnessing something that felt intimate and uncomfortable, a family mythology collapsing in real time. But you always looked so casual, my mother said finally, and there was something almost pleading in her voice, as though she was searching for evidence that she hadn't been entirely wrong. You never talked about business things. You never seemed. She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Successful? I offered gently. The thing about building something from scratch is that for the first few years, you're too exhausted and focused to perform success for an audience. I was working. I am working. The casual clothes are because I'm usually in the office until midnight. The not talking about it was because every time I tried, I was told it wasn't a real job. Marcus checked his watch with an exaggerated gesture, his bluntness a strange comfort in the moment. Jordan, I'm sorry, but we really do need to go. The Singapore team is waiting, and we've got about 29 hours now. He was right, I nodded, turning to my mother. I have to leave. I'm sorry to miss the rest of the party. But even as I said it, I knew the party had fundamentally changed, that whispered conversations would begin the moment we left, that my mother would spend the rest of the evening answering questions she wasn't prepared to answer. My mother reached out, her hand catching my arm. Her grip was tight, almost desperate. Jordan, wait. I didn't know. You should have told me. You should have. But what she saw in my face must have stopped her, because she released my arm. her hand falling to her side. I did tell you, I said again, not unkindly, just stating a fact. You weren't ready to hear it. Maybe you are now. We left then, my team and I, walking through the suddenly quiet banquet hall toward the exit. I could feel eyes following us, feel the weight of revised perceptions and recalculated assumptions. Chen opened the car door. Priya slid into the back seat with her laptop already open. Marcus was on his phone coordinating with the rest of the team. The car pulled away from the venue, from the orchids and crystal chandeliers, from my mother's carefully constructed world where I had been the disappointment, the cautionary tale, the child who hadn't quite managed. Sorry if we caused a scene, boss, Chen said quietly from the front seat. We didn't realize we were walking into whatever that was. I shook my head, watching the city lights blur past the window. You didn't cause anything. You just revealed what was already true. Sometimes people need to hear things from strangers because they've decided they can't hear them from you. The office was bright when we arrived. The rest of the team scattered across workstations, surrounded by empty coffee cups and the particular energy of people solving a complex problem against a tight deadline. They looked up when we entered, relief and determination mixing on their faces. These people, smart, dedicated, brilliant in their specific ways, had chosen to work with me, had believed in something we were building together. My phone buzzed. A text from my father. Your mother is very shaken. We need to talk. Also, congratulations. I'm proud of you. Then, a moment later, another message from my brother. Holy shit. Mom's face. That was the most epic thing I've ever witnessed at a family party. I set the phone down and turned to the presentation materials spread across the conference table. The Singapore contract represented months of work, hundreds of hours of negotiation, technical specifications, financial projections. It represented something built carefully, patiently, without fanfare or validation from the people whose validation I'd once thought I needed. My mother's shock, her public correction, the visible crumbling of the narrative she'd constructed, none of it had been planned. I hadn't brought my employees to humiliate her. I hadn't orchestrated the revelation for maximum impact. But perhaps that's what made it so devastating. The truth had simply emerged, undeniable and complete, at the exact moment she was most committed to her fiction. 3 days later, after we'd submitted the presentation and won the Singapore contract, after the champagne celebration with the team and the congratulatory emails from investors, I sat in a coffee shop across from my mother. She had requested the meeting, her voice uncertain on the phone in a way I'd never heard before. She looked smaller somehow, without the armor of her friends and her assumptions. I owe you an apology, she said, her coffee untouched before her. I've been thinking about everything I said, all the times I introduced you as unemployed, as struggling. I was wrong. I was so wrong. I waited, letting her continue. I think I was scared, she said, finally. You were doing something I didn't understand, taking risks I couldn't quantify. Your brother became a surgeon, that's a path I understood. Your father was an engineer, my father was a lawyer. But what you were building, I couldn't see it. So I decided it wasn't real. I made you fit my fear instead of seeing who you actually were. Her eyes were bright with tears she was too proud to let fall. Can you forgive me? Forgiveness is complicated. It's not a switch you flip or a debt you cancel. It's more like slowly unclenching a fist that's been closed so long the muscles ache. I can try, I said honestly. But I need you to understand something. I didn't need your approval to be successful. I built Meridian with or without your belief in it. What hurt wasn't that you didn't understand the business, it was that you never asked. You decided who I was and stopped looking. She nodded slowly, accepting the truth of it. I'm looking now, she said quietly. Tell me about it. Tell me about Meridian, about what you've built. I want to understand. And so I did. I told her about the early days, the first client, the moment we knew we had something scalable. I told her about the team, about the problems we solved, about the vision I had for where we could go. She listened with the focused attention of someone trying to memorize a map of previously unexplored territory. She asked questions, some basic, some surprisingly insightful. And slowly, carefully, we began to construct a new understanding, one built on who I actually was, rather than who she'd needed me to be. Perhaps revenge is the wrong word for what happened in that banquet hall. Revenge implies intention, a deliberate orchestration of consequences. What occurred was something else, a collision between maintained fiction and emergent truth, between comfortable narrative and uncomfortable reality. My mother had spent years introducing me in ways that diminished my choices and dismissed my work, not from malice but from fear and misunderstanding. And in a single moment, in front of her friends and family, that entire constructed narrative had collapsed under the weight of simple facts spoken by people who had no reason to lie. The sweetest vindications are often the quietest ones, the moments when you realize you no longer need the approval you once desperately sought. I had built something real, something that mattered, something that employed 43 people across 8 countries. I had done it without my mother's understanding or support, which meant her eventual recognition was affirming but not necessary. The validation came from the work itself, from the problems solved and the clients served, from the team that showed up because they believed in what we were creating together. There's a particular kind of freedom that comes from being underestimated. It removes the pressure of expectations, the weight of other people's dreams. My mother's consistent dismissal had been painful, but it had also been clarifying. It had forced me to build conviction from internal sources, to develop certainty that didn't depend on external approval. And when the moment of revelation came, it came not from my defense of myself, but from the simple fact of people who depended on me. People for whom I wasn't a disappointment or a concern, but a leader, a founder, someone whose vision they had chosen to help realize. In the weeks that followed, something shifted in my family. My mother began introducing me differently, not with the overcorrection of newfound pride, but with simple accuracy. "This is Jordan, my youngest. They run a tech company." My father asked detailed questions about our technical architecture, his engineer's mind delighting in the complexity of what we'd built. My brother joked that I'd provided the most entertaining moment in our family's history, and could he please bring his friends to the next gathering where I might be publicly vindicated. The dynamic had changed, recalibrated by truth finally spoken and heard. But perhaps the deepest satisfaction came not from family recognition, but from returning to the office, to the work itself, to the problems that needed solving and the vision that needed realizing. The Singapore contract was just one milestone. There would be others, larger and more complex, requiring the same patience and precision that had built everything so far. My team didn't care about my family drama. They cared that I showed up, that I led clearly, that I had built something worth being part of, that, in the end, was the truest revenge against dismissal, becoming someone whose work spoke louder than anyone's words about them. Families are complicated ecosystems of expectation and identity, love and control. Parents carry visions of who their children should become, and when reality diverges from that vision, some adapt while others cling to the script they've written. My mother had written me as the struggling child, the one who needed guidance back to the approved path. She had introduced me that way so many times she'd begun to believe it herself, despite mounting evidence to the contrary. And perhaps she needed that public collision with truth, that moment of undeniable revelation, to finally release the narrative she'd constructed and see what had been there all along. The real lesson wasn't about revenge or vindication. It was about the persistence of truth, the way reality eventually asserts itself regardless of how carefully we try to manage appearances. It was about the dignity of building something real, even when the people you love most can't or won't see it. It was about the quiet strength that comes from continuing forward when the validation you seek isn't coming, from finding your conviction in the work itself rather than in other people's recognition of the work. And out there, in countless family gatherings and social events, there are others living some version of this story, building things their parents don't understand, walking paths their families can't validate, creating value in forms that don't fit traditional metrics of success. They're the entrepreneurs dismissed as unemployed, the artists called hobbyists, the visionaries labeled as lost. And someday, perhaps at a party or a dinner or some other ordinary moment, the truth they've been building will emerge, undeniable and complete. And those who couldn't see them will finally have to look. That moment, when quiet persistence meets loud revelation, when dismissal meets documentation, when love finally has to acknowledge reality, that's when the most profound transformations happen, not through revenge, but through truth. Simply, finally, being told.